Hello and welcome back to part 3 of the CertCentral Training Certification Program. In this final section, we will conclude with reviewing the CertCentral account settings, and within that, we're going to look at some of the email settings, some of the advanced settings on how CertCentral will behave for various conditions like domain validation, etc. We're going to look at some of the notification systems in terms of where emails should get sent. We're going to also take a look at the access control methods within CertCentral. We're going to have a look at some of the product settings and how that can be configured. And then finally, just taking a look at custom fields and what we can do around there. All right, so the final piece, we're going to first start off by looking at the preferences section of the CertCentral settings module. So there's the basic things which relates to how time is displayed. On the order request page, whenever someone requests a certificate, you can add a particular note. There's some settings related to client certificates where you can add contact emails and a phone number, and then specifically those related to the lifecycle settings of the SSL, TLS, and code signing certificates, and the renewals around that. So one of the features that's quite important is what we call the escalation feature. And the escalation feature basically allows anyone to add an additional email address for a particular cadence in which we will send renewal notifications. So as an example, let's say that you want to add an escalation feature, which basically says that on the 7th day before a certificate expires, as an example, and perhaps on the 3-day notice, you want to add additional email address, like for instance, a distribution list or something that a customer would want to use to notify them of an expiring certificate. And in the case of expiring certificates, these can cause outages. And so it's important to understand that what this escalation feature does is it allows people to add their own email addresses in addition to those that have been added onto the orders at various points in CertCentral, such as the person that requested it or perhaps additional emails section. This is in addition to that. So that's what the escalation feature does. There's also a renewal message that you can enter that instructs users to do something specific as part of the renewal. Maybe it's entering certain information. And then we have these other options, which is you can turn on renewal notifications for client certificates, as well as being able to turn on renewals for discovered non-DigiCert certificates. So this relates to the discovery feature, which is also not part of today's training. But the point is that for the discovery service, those items those certificates that have been discovered, maybe self-signed certificates that are not DigiCert certificates, CertCentral does allow the capability of automatically sending an email if they are expiring. So the next piece that we're going to look at is the advanced settings. So the verified contact section over here basically allows people to add a non-DigiCert CertCentral user to be used as a verified contact. So if this option is not checked, it means that if someone adds an organization to the account or they want to add an existing contact to an organization, it has to be a CertCentral user. It cannot, they won't have the option to enter some nondescript user. Of course, you can also choose the default way in which the certificate gets sent to or delivered to someone. So in this case, what this is saying is that all certificates that are sent from CertCentral, the default manner in which the pickup email will be created is the certificate is available through a download link. Again, if that needs to be changed to like plain text or some other attachment, that can be done over here. So active validation, so this just means that if you would like DigiCert to automatically reach out to you when your organizations are coming up for expiration, then this is the option that would ensure that. Note that this applies to organizations only and not domains. So then it's also possible to change the DCV methods that are available to the account. So for instance, let's say that in an account, we wanted to disable CNAME and file authentication, or HTTP practical demonstration, as valid methods on how to prove control over a domain. And so in this case, we would show the DNS text as an alternative DCV method. And of course, the one that we're always going to show, and one that's not changeable, is the email method. So in part one, I mentioned that we'll talk a little bit more about the different email addresses that are available for us to send DCV emails to. So when sending a domain control verification email, you can't just simply type any email address that you'd like. They actually have to either be a set email address that sort of belongs to the domain in question, or a specific org or technical contact or administrator contact that's available and specifically listed on the WHOIS records for that domain. So if there aren't any, by default, we will send them, for example, to these 5 if these email aliases exist. So we can see that there is the admin, administrator, webmaster, postmaster, and hostmaster. So these will always be available for us to send these emails to. Then we also have the default domain validation scope. So this is a very important one. This basically says when you submit a domain for validation, let's say, for example, that you want to use the DNS text validation method. What this is saying is that if you submit, for instance, a certificate for example.domain.com, what this is saying is that we are then going to expect the random value that we give you to exist on the base domain, meaning just domain.com, not example.domain.com. And when you authenticate that value on the base domain, then what that means is we will automatically approve any request that is a prefix of the base domain. So the base domain is kind of like domain.com. That's what we would consider to be the base domain. And so the idea for the base domain validation is to make it a lot easier to get certificates and to prove control of a domain. For example, if every single request for a domain is entered into the account and is always approved on the base domain level, then it means that future requests for that domain will always be approved without requiring additional validations. If, however, this other option is chosen, where you would choose the exact domain name for validation, that means that we would expect the random value then, for example, to be on example.domain.com. And if someone else wanted to get a certificate for test.domain.com, they would not be able to, because the original validation information did not match. It didn't match example.domain.com, and test.domain.com is not a subdomain or a prefix of test.domain.com. So then a few other options. We can see that we've got the certificate transparency or CT logging options. So in this case, CT logging is actually turned off for the account. Important to note that for those of you that are not familiar, all publicly trusted certificates, if they are to be shown as valid in a browser, they need to be logged to the certificate transparency servers. So in this case, it's been turned off on an account level. If it is available on an account level, it's possible to simply modify whether or not you want requests to be logged to the CT logs or not. There are some additional features. For example, if you want users to be able to add new organizations when requesting certificates, they can do that, or you can disallow that. The same can be for contacts. If you want to ensure that they cannot add other contacts to the certificates, then you can choose this particular option. And then we also have a level of customization around approval steps. Now, in part 1 and part 2 of the CertCentral training certification program that I reviewed, I demonstrated the act of ordering certificates. We spoke about requests, and we spoke about users and who is allowed to issue a certificate. Approval steps configuration changes some of the behavior around approvals and what that means. So for instance, you could choose to simply skip the approval step for certificate requests from administrators and managers. So note that there's an important detail here, which is that there are scenarios where even if this skip approval step has been chosen, it doesn't mean that approval won't be required. So for example, we see there that it says administrator approvals are still required for any other user that's not a administrator or manager role. And it also means that any guest URL or guest access request, those outside of CertCentral will, and revocation requests will still require approval. In terms of if approvals are required, um, if the one-step approval is required, it means that an administrator even, they would place a request and that request would require approval. But it means that because it's only a one-step, it means that the administrator that placed the request or the manager can also approve their own request. Now, naturally, if it's very likely that that user would not want to keep approving their own requests, and so they could choose this option to say automatically approve new and reissue certificate requests when the requester is also an approver. However, if you do require an even more stringent mechanism for approving certificates, you can add the two-step layer. And what that means is the two steps is you may have an administrator, he has full privileges, and the account is not restricted to any divisions. If you have the two steps process, it means that you, even though you have an administrator, they can order a certificate, they approve the certificate, there's still some another user that has to go and approve the request. So them being an administrator doesn't matter, there needs to be at least two people. So then we also have the option for domain validated certificates to require approvals or not, or client certificates. And then lastly, on these items, we have certificate revocations. So in the first section of this training, first module, I spoke about the difference between orders and certificates. And what this option over here says that if someone wants to revoke a certificate through the API, as an example, and you'll see there's a description here which says that it's going to revoke the certificate but leave the order valid. So in other words, you could simply reissue the certificate. There'd be no new transaction that would be required. And this is kind of just the default behavior as you see it today. This option, however, basically means that when all certificates that belong to a particular order are revoked, then revoke the order as well. And if that is done within 30 days, then the order will be fully refunded, given the DigiCert 30-day money-back guarantee policy. And then this alternate order ID, this just means that when you're placing requests through the API, you can basically make a distinction between orders having this additional metadata by giving it an alternative order ID, and they cannot be the same. So you can ensure that you can place subsequent requests without them being duplicates. So the next section we'll just quickly touch on is the notifications. So the notifications section, what that gives us is just the ability on where to send account notifications and lifecycle. So in this case, account notifications could include those notifications that are something like whether someone placed a request for a certificate. For instance, if there's an administrator's, um, then all administrators, for example, would receive an approval for a certificate. But if you wanted additional users to receive that kind of information, then this is what you would use this one for. So this would be basically anything related to account management rather than limited to only individual certificate management. Um, we've got here the emergency notifications email field. So this is in the case of DigiCert needing to reach out to customers to specifically inform them of something critical, such as perhaps a certificate revocation. Then we would be able to reach out to the emergency revocation. It's very important that that is populated. And then the last piece is with regards to certificate lifecycle email defaults. So this basically says that by default, we would, for instance, send renewal notifications as well as the delivery of the certificate once it's issued to either the organization, the technical contact, the user placing the order, which would be the CertCentral user in this case, um, or in the case of when there's an organization approval email to the user that's placing the order. And then this email language basically just refers to the language in which the emails will be delivered. So for instance, the renewal emails, what language do they need to be constructed in? The next thing that we're going to quickly touch on is access control to CertCentral. So, in part two, we spoke in detail about the different user roles in CertCentral, administrators, managers, and so on. But in addition to these different role restrictions, each individual user also has the ability to gain a kind of a better way or a better level of control over who can access their account. And so I mentioned in the first section that um, all users require at a minimum a username and password combination with this option to add two-factor authentication onto their login. And there's basically two different requirements that we have. So you can choose between either um, a one-time password, and the one-time password is, for instance, the code that you would need to enter based on a one-time password compatible application, like for instance Google Authenticator or Authy, etc. And this is something that you would be prompted to set up the first time you log in, and then subsequent logins you would then have to use your OTP application to authenticate in addition to your username and password. Alternatively, you could set the requirement to be a client certificate, in which case you would generate the certificate in a browser, and when you're trying to authenticate to CertCentral, it's going to ask you to supply the certificate as well as your username and password. In addition, an administrator can choose whether or not this should apply perhaps to only a specific user, in which case they can add the user, or they can make this an account-wide setting to ensure maximum security for all users. If there is a requirement to, for instance, reset the two-factor authentication or the access, an administrator can do that on this particular page. Just wait quickly for that to load. So you'll see that you could delete a requirement, in which case when someone tries to log in, they're no longer going to be prompted to use their two-factor authentication method, and it'll just be the username and password. Or if there is some sort of client certificate that got deleted or corrupt, they can click reset, and then they'll be asked to set that up again the next time they log in, rather than just being locked out of their account. So this is for issued client certificates, and this is for one-time password devices where you can choose to reset their login. So note that a administrator would need to do this for for users. So a standard user, for instance, wouldn't be able to do this reset process for themselves. So the next thing we'll talk about is single sign-on. So I mentioned this slightly when covering the section with users and how you can restrict users, and when you're adding users, you can restrict them to only being able to log into CertCentral using single sign-on. And really what single sign-on is, using SAML 2.0, is the ability to integrate your identity provider into CertCentral, giving you additional layers of security by requiring users first to authenticate to your own identity provider in your organization, and then only allowing them into CertCentral. So this could be, let's say an organization is using Okta as their identity provider, the single sign-on, single pane of glass, and they want all users to log into CertCentral, for instance, through Okta. That would mean then that CertCentral would be an application that it gets assigned to a particular user, and they would be able to log in that manner. So in that case, Okta would be the identity provider, and DigiCert would be the service provider. And so the single sign-on configuration would require you to complete this form based on the identity provider and how you would like to enter this information. So for instance, a SAML attribute in this case could be like an email address that a user would use, and that would identify them in terms of when they want to authenticate to the portal. Now, what's important to understand here is that these need to be existing CertCentral users. So when a SAML connection authenticates to CertCentral, the user is not automatically created, or a session is automatically created without being tied to an existing user. So the workflow is the users have to be invited. You will then set up the connection between identity provider and the service provider, and then they will be able to log in like that. Fairly straightforward on how to set that up. We have configuration instructions, so there shouldn't be any difficulty or complexity in setting up these SAML connections. The next one that we can quickly move on to is IP restrictions as an access control method. So the first part of that would be switching on IP restrictions, and then of course having to add a rule to define what the restriction should be. So there's a couple of ways in which you can describe a restriction. So it could be, for instance, a single IP address, or it could be an IP address range. Maybe the CertCentral account only wants to allow IP addresses for particular countries, like maybe those based in the USA, and any other logins that are coming from any other countries need to be denied. So in this case, you can also specify the restriction type. So the one is account-wide, meaning anyone that logs in, whether it's through the API that tries to authenticate to CertCentral or a CertCentral user. It could also then be just for a specific user. That could be another option, and then they would have to specify the user that has this restriction. Or it could be for all guest URLs, meaning that any access to these public URLs would have to be done through that would be restricted through all guest URLs, or of course you can just choose a specific one. And the next part of this would be we're going to take a look at the product settings. Okay, and here we can see the product settings page. We're going to look a little bit more into this. It's really just a way of allowing users or maybe divisions to choose which products that they can order and control the level of functionality that they're allowed to see. So it could be done either by role or by division. So in this case, you can see that all divisions in this account will use the settings below by default. So if you want to customize that for a particular division, we could definitely do that. So if I only wanted to make a certain product unavailable, let's say I want to make, EV certificates perhaps unavailable for this division, and we're just going to click save. So then we'll see that there's going to be the summary for this particular division and what they can order. And we can see in this case, these other products have been disabled, and these are the ones that are available. So for particular products, you can also customize what some of the additional options are. So you can restrict validity periods. So for instance, in the case of multi-year, you could say um, only 1 years are allowed. Um, you can also choose the issuing CA default if you wanted to. So as an example, let's say, for instance, that for like this particular account, this particular division, only these two intermediates need to be available. And then perhaps from here, you could choose uh, the default that needs to be available. So let's say that is, for instance, this one over here. So that means that when someone tries to enroll for a certificate under this division, they're going to have the option to choose from both, but by default, it'll just choose this one. You can also limit the hash that's associated with the request. So maybe only 512 and 384 is going to be allowed. There's also the auto renew and auto reissue functions that can be configured here. And then of course the maximum number of SANs and whether or not wildcards are allowed. So let's say for instance that there's no problem with the number of SANs, but maybe wildcards pose a particular security risk for the business, and they don't really want that functionality to exist. So they would update that and just choose save settings. So then the last piece that we're going to come to is the custom order form fields. So this is really a nice way for customers to use additional metadata that they want to capture with an order. So this could be, for instance, just a single custom order form field like a cost center number, but this could also, perhaps be sort of, the name of a project. And that could be the input type could be various items. It could be text or an integer, or perhaps it's a drop-down menu. So in this case, let's say like we'll just call it a blue, and let's just call it red. And we can make whether or not these need to be required for new requests. In other words, are they going to be mandatory or not? In this case, I've said they're optional. Once I've created it, of course, I can still just modify that. Maybe let's say that I'm going to require that for new requests. So in this case, if I try to order a certificate, we can see that within the form, I would have to look at choosing the particular division, because as I covered in the second module of this training, divisions have specific constraints associated with them, and in this case you saw that I've constrained additional product setting constraints to the division, and that's why we'll just have to first select that before proceeding. And as you can see, if you scroll down to the bottom, we've got the two custom field options. So that means, for instance, that they have to choose a project name and a cost center number. And once they complete that information, they can just click submit, and they can go ahead and get their certificate. And that concludes the training. That concludes the third module for the CertCentral Professional Certification Program. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope you enjoyed the content.